I want to ask you, do you see a parallel between the relatively contemporary migration of people from overseas that tried tutoring work and what Joyce did after leaving Ireland?
I mean, yes and no. Joyce was doing sort of teaching language when he was when he moved to Trieste, partly out of necessity because there weren't really too many employment prospects for him. In general, he felt he had to leave Ireland for various personal reasons, many of which had to deal with his, let's just say, difficult personality. I mean, one of the interesting things that you see when he moves to Trieste and finally sort of settles into the role of a language teacher at Berlitz is that he takes a very different approach to the languages to language instruction, and just dealing with multiple languages. His Jesuit education in Ireland has been very rote and mechanical, teaching grammar, teaching rules, whereas in Berlitz he adopted to the more conversational approach that language is something you live as opposed to something you study. And that makes it, I think, an interesting shift in terms of his own use of language as a writer. And whether that sort of parallels contemporary experiences with migration. I mean, there's a large intervening history in between, and so I'd be reluctant to draw quick and ready parallels.
Yeah, and usually now, what are the challenges of teaching Joyce in a pedagogical perspective? How do you make his ideas, his style, and like his soul echo in a classroom and create interest among the students?
I mean, to some extent, I have maybe some advantage teaching Joyce in Ireland, where there is already sort of a kind of inbuilt attention and interest in Joyce, whether from students who are Irish or whether students who are visiting from abroad. And especially the latter category, to some extent, Joyce is one of the things on the checklist of things to do while here. So I don't have to do too much in terms of trying to attract interest. There's a kind of a pre-existing marketplace, as it were. But I do try to sort of point out ways in which Joyce can be relevant, but also ways in which that go against, or at least somewhat contradict, the general popular reception, reputation of Joyce that exists in Ireland, where to a large extent it is. Joyce has become a kind of commodity. And I try to sort of read past that and see what is interesting, perhaps revolutionary about what he's doing.
Yeah, when you talk about the idea of Joyce as a commodity, it's very easy to see during Bloomsday, where like the pints are very more expensive. But do you see something about this commodification of Joyce in like the day-to-day life? For example, we remembered Leopold Bloom complaining about the lack of especially female bathrooms in Dublin. And there are pubs even now which use like the Joyce name or stuff like that like require passwords and for you to buy something before you even get inside the bathroom, for example.
Yeah.
Do you see this commodification as an obstacle to teaching these revolutionary values of Joyce nowadays?
I mean, yeah, because it sort of reduces Joyce to a commodity, just a nice little, gift bag that you can buy, and as if that's a kind of replacement for reading or engaging with the works. I mean, Joyce is hardly the only writer or artist to which these things have happened.
Yeah, but like he's probably one of whom his values echo the most nowadays, because he was like he had to teach, he had to tutor English language. He had these problems with housing and almost starving, and healthcare, especially his dental healthcare. And it seems like 100 years later, not much has changed. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, it's not overtly brought up in Ulysses, but it comes up enough times when he sees issues around a housing crisis, and the only types of housing that are available are substandard. At one point, Bloom thinks Kerwin's mushroom houses, mushroom house being sort of an expression at the time of something that's hastily and badly built. That Dublin has a long history of not being able to provide good quality housing. Bloom has, and this is one specific health issue that has improved, but the issue of health problem in general does remain. You see that Bloom has a kind of constant low-grade paranoia about tuberculosis. That if he sees someone who's slightly symptomatic, oh yeah, a little bit facing the red, he's coughing a bit. He's continually worried about it. Towards the end, we find out that 2 of his 3 closest childhood friends died of tuberculosis, which would explain it. And it's also that when he thinks of his dream house, that it's located either in Dundrum or Sutton. Both are locations are noted for their relatively dry climate and are recommended for those that might be susceptible to tuberculosis. So it even informs where his dream house is. Rates of tuberculosis in Ireland at the turn of the 20th century were much higher than elsewhere in Europe because of insufficient health care, but also the climate. So Bloom's anxiety, paranoia does reflect a larger social situation. And while tuberculosis might be less of a problem now, health issues do remain. So yeah, there are things to which one can sort of plug in contemporary references. This is one thing that is, it's not as big as a news story now as it was a few years ago, but the insufficiencies of the Dublin water supply. It's sort of coming up again a little bit, but after some work was done, but it does need a thorough overhaul. We have a lengthy description in Ithaca of the Dublin waterworks. And this was, at the time, it was a vast project. It was criticized in some quarters that the residents of the wealthier suburbs were unhappy with it, that their tax money had to go to subsidize water for sort of the poorer residents of the urban core. But the project did go ahead, and it was revolutionary in terms of, it was a significant amelioration of the quality of life in Dublin. But the vast extent of the waterworks, as described in Ulysses, more or less, those haven't been upgraded since. So yeah, he does plug into these issues.
Yeah, and how do you think Ulysses, especially Ulysses, inspires some type of curiosity in the students in the way that it's one way to teach an author and explain stuff like when he's far away. It's for example Shakespeare, for example William Blake, but like with Ulysses, some of the moments described in the novel can be lived by the students in the city. So like, do you believe there's a more, the best term I can use to describe is like eroticism to reading Ulysses here in Dublin as compared to just a simple like interpretation from far away?
It's mixed, because on the one hand, like when we talk about a historically distant author, that creates its own challenges, and to some extent, degrees of historical contextualization may be needed, but you can also go too far and just drown out the author with this kind of data. So you have to find an appropriate balance, which is a difficult negotiation. On the one hand, Joyce is historically closer, and if you're reading him in Dublin, there's still a greater proximity still. That proximity can also be misleading, because you might be blind to changes that have happened. That I used to make this mistake, and I was reading something by a very good Joycean who also made the same mistake. The Holles Street Hospital, the building that stands by Marion Square, was built in the 1930s. That's not the Holles Hospital that existed in the time of Ulysses. But because the building is an older style, it certainly seems like it could well have been, but it just isn't. And that's a fairly minor example, but there are ways in which the city has changed that one might be oblivious to and not keep track of. It also happens, especially in terms of the specificities of what's called Hiberno-English, the dialect of English that's spoken here, the ways in which that has changed. It is on the one hand close, but it's also perhaps more foreign than one might appreciate at first blush.
And finally, do you believe that Nietzsche's lectures published in Anti-Education are good perspectives to wonder about Ulysses and Joyce, to be made more educational? Like, if students are to be educated by journalism and in mainstream culture, is there a possible synergy between academia and the mainstream cultural sphere?
Well, there should be, but how to sort of negotiate that is challenging in different types of text. Different disciplines have their own sort of immediate challenges. I mean, one of the things in terms of teaching a work of literature is that, to some extent, there's a kind of, not necessarily purely factual basis, but there's a scholarly basis that deals with a certain type of analysis. And these kinds of modes of thinking and of reading often, not always, but often go against reading something for aesthetic pleasure, reading something for enjoyment. And I certainly don't always succeed, but try to balance the two together. That this is that reading Ulysses is not a work of scholarship. We may read works of scholarship about Ulysses alongside it, but it is a literary work. It's meant to be appreciated and understood on an aesthetic level. And to try and negotiate that, and that might be one of the ways in which to sort of how an academic approach could be leveraged to have a larger cultural impact.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I was reading Ulysses and Us by Declan Kiberd, and one of the first passages from the book, not the first probably, where he says something about the corporate university taking a hold of the discourse of Ulysses as in making Joyce a master technician and not a literary work of wisdom. I don't know how to elaborate this question, but like, do you believe there's a Kantian way of reading Ulysses, especially nowadays, that might be synergistic with the academia? Because sometimes it feels like we have like hundreds and hundreds of books, of journals, of new translations, of critical translations of Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, and it may drown out the idea that it is just a funny book to read. Like, how do you recover this idea that is just like a funny book, that is a book about love, a book about learning, a book about everything? But yeah.
And it's also, I mean, there's a lot that I like in Kiberd's book, and I think very much support that idea. But the way he phrased it in his book is that Ulysses is a book of wisdom, despite the second half, that's where Joyce becomes the master technician and so on and so forth. And my rejoinder is, I think it's actually, one can read it as a book of wisdom precisely because of that. That the technical mastery, the sophistication, and so on, are not distractions from those points, but that is exactly how they manifest, how they are occasioned. And so that's maybe, at least in terms of Joyce, with other writers will require other strategies, that might be one way to try and reconcile those two strategies. And that's also within academic discourse. Sometimes certain things have to be technical and so on. That doesn't mean that a technical investigation into Joyce's use of certain literary precedents, literary sources, how he composed his drafts, something like that might be written for a specialist. That doesn't necessarily mean that as a kind of that doesn't necessarily characterize the whole range of the academic discourse on Joyce in that way. Just there are a wide variety of different styles that are needed.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. That's it, I think.
Okay, thank you.